On Thanksgiving night, my mother-in-law looked straight at me in front of the entire family and said, "You don't belong in this house." I smiled, placing a thick envelope on the walnut dining table, right next to the carving knife. Just one notarized seal to verify. The estate manager nodded. The mansion's lighting system flickered once as the homeowner access was transferred, and I asked, "Would you like to leave my house, or would you prefer to ask permission to stay through dinner?" "My name is Ava Hart, and I've learned that belonging isn't granted, it's taken." The wrought iron gates of Briarcliff Manor parted before our Tesla like curtains, revealing a stage I'd never asked to perform on. Ethan's hand found mine across the center console, a gesture meant to comfort, but his palm was damp with the same anxiety that made my stomach twist. The November wind carried the scent of burning oak from somewhere deep within the estate, mixing with the earthy decay of wet leaves that carpeted the long driveway. "Mother outdid herself this year," Ethan murmured, his voice carrying that particular strain it always held when discussing Margaret Hart. The mansion loomed ahead, its limestone facade glowing amber under strategically placed uplights that turned Gothic Revival architecture into something almost theatrical. Every window blazed with warm light, promising the kind of gathering that would appear perfect in a society magazine spread. My heels clicked against the granite steps, each sound echoing in the covered portico like a countdown. The massive oak door swung open before we could knock, and there she stood, Margaret Hart, 61 years old and dressed in winter white cashmere that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her smile was practiced, perfected over decades of charity galas and country club luncheons. "Ethan, darling," she cooed, embracing her son with genuine warmth that evaporated the moment her gaze shifted to me. "And Ms. Morrison," Morrison, my maiden name, despite 3 years of marriage to her son, despite the gold band on my finger that matched Ethan's, despite legally being Ava Hart for longer than some of her friends' marriages had lasted. "It's Hart, Mother," Ethan corrected weakly, but Margaret had already turned away, her attention captured by the caterers arranging something elaborate near the marble staircase. "Of course, dear, do come in before you catch cold, though I suppose someone from your background is quite used to the elements." The barb was delivered with such sweetness that anyone listening might have mistaken it for concern. But I heard it the subtle emphasis on "your background," as if being raised by an electrician father and librarian mother was something contagious. As we moved through the foyer, I noticed them a crew in black uniforms bearing the Northgate Estate Services logo. They weren't caterers. I recognized the diagnostic tablets they carried, the way they examined door locks and window sensors with methodical precision. One of them was installing something near the main electrical panel, his movements efficient and purposeful. "Updating the security system," I asked Margaret, keeping my tone conversational. She barely glanced at the workers. "The owner is quite particular about maintenance. Everything must be perfect for occasions like these." She said "owner" with a peculiar emphasis, as if reminding me that this wasn't her house either. We were all guests in someone else's domain. Though I suppose you wouldn't understand the complexities of managing such properties. "Your little apartment in the city must be so much simpler." I smiled, the kind of smile I'd perfected in boardrooms when men twice my age tried to explain my own product specifications to me. "Actually, we live in a brownstone now, but you're right, I do prefer things simple. Clear ownership, clear boundaries, clear titles." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, perhaps sensing something beneath my words she couldn't quite identify. Behind her, another Northgate technician was photographing the smart home control panel, documenting serial numbers with the kind of attention usually reserved for property transfers. "How fascinating that you're hosting Thanksgiving here," I continued, watching her carefully. "It must be wonderful to have such temporary authority over a place like this." "Temporary." Margaret's laugh tinkled like crystal. "My dear, the Harts have been hosting Thanksgiving at Premier Estates for generations. We belong in places like this." It's about understanding society, tradition, the proper order of things. Some people, her gaze swept over my simple black dress. The one Ethan had said looked elegant, but his mother clearly found lacking. Some people are meant to visit these heights. Others are born to them. The sound of car doors slamming outside announced more arrivals. Margaret's sister Patricia, followed by cousins whose names I'd learned but who'd never bothered to learn mine. They swept in with air kisses and casual wealth, their conversation flowing around me like I was furniture. That's when I felt my phone vibrate. A message from Naomi Blake, encrypted, seller-motivated, reviewing your LLC's offer tonight. I glanced at the Northgate team, at the mansion's bones being cataloged and documented, at Margaret holding court like a queen in a borrowed castle. She had no idea that Maple Key Holdings LLC was about to make an all-cash offer that would be impossible to refuse. No idea that the little apartment girl she kept trying to diminish had liquidated enough intellectual property to buy this entire charade. "Ava, dear," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the foyer. "Would you mind helping in the kitchen? I'm sure that's more your milieu. 3 hours until dinner. 3 hours to smile, to nod, to endure. 3 hours until I could show them all what belonging really meant, having your name on the deed." The kitchen suggestion shouldn't have surprised me. Margaret had been directing me toward service areas since the day Ethan introduced us. But as I stood there in the foyer, surrounded by people who looked through me rather than at me, my mind drifted back to all the moments that had led to this one. The first time was at our wedding rehearsal dinner. Margaret had pulled me aside while the guests mingled over champagne and canapes, her fingers adjusting the neckline of my dress with the efficiency of someone handling defective merchandise. "It's a bit much, don't you think?" she'd said, loud enough for her friends to hear. I know a seamstress who could add a modesty panel. We wouldn't want people getting the wrong impression about what kind of girl Ethan is marrying. What kind of girl? As if my doctorate in computer science, my role at Lumen Grid Labs, my patents in distributed computing systems, none of it mattered next to the fact that I'd grown up in a row house in Queens instead of a colonial in Connecticut. Then came the family dinners, each one a carefully orchestrated humiliation. "So, Ava," Margaret would begin, always when the table was fullest. "Remind us what exactly you do. Something with computers." She'd wave her hand dismissively before I could answer. I suppose someone has to do that sort of work. Though I do worry about Ethan's prospects, tied to someone in such an unstable field. Tech bubbles burst. You know, old money endures. The post-nuptial agreement had been her masterpiece. 6 months after our wedding, she'd ambushed us at what I thought was a birthday dinner for Ethan. Instead, her lawyer sat at the table with documents that would protect Hart family assets from any claim I might make. "It's standard for our kind of families," Margaret had explained, as if I were too common to understand. "Surely you see the wisdom in protecting generational wealth from temporary arrangements?" Ethan had been torn. I could see it in his eyes, but he'd pushed the papers toward me anyway. "Just to keep peace, Ava. You know I don't care about any of this." But he did care. He cared enough to let his mother define our marriage as temporary, our bond as suspicious, my presence as a threat to their bloodline's financial purity. What Margaret didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been quietly building my own wealth, not inherited, not married into, but earned through 16-hour days debugging code, through innovations that made our data compression algorithms industry-leading, through a portfolio of patents that tech giants would pay millions to license. The liquidity event she'd never see coming was already in motion. Bytestream Dynamics had offered 8 figures for my compression protocol suite. The papers would be signed Monday morning at 9. I wasn't the daughter of electrical contractors and librarians anymore, or rather, I was. But I was also someone who could write a check that would make Margaret's trust fund look like pocket change. You know what I find interesting about old money? I'd asked Margaret once, after she'd spent 20 minutes explaining why new money was inherently vulgar. It's always someone else's achievement, someone else's success, passed down like a participation trophy. At least when I sign my name on something, it's because I built it." She'd laughed, that tinkling crystal laugh. "How wonderfully American of you to think that matters." But it did matter. It mattered that every dollar in my accounts came from problems I'd solved, systems I'd designed, value I'd created. It mattered that when Lumen Grid's CEO called me at 11:30 p.m. to handle critical system failures, he wasn't calling because of my last name or my husband's connections. He was calling because I was the only one who could fix it. Standing in that foyer now, watching Margaret orchestrate her Thanksgiving performance, I felt the weight of every slight, every dismissal, every reminder that I would never be enough for her son. Not because I lacked love for Ethan, I had loved him, truly. But because I lacked the right grandfather, the right prep school, the right debutante ball invitation that would have marked me as belonging. "The kitchen," I said finally, meeting Margaret's expectant gaze. "Of course. I'm sure that's where I'll be most useful." Her smile widened, satisfied. She had no idea that while she was arranging place cards to emphasize social hierarchy, I was arranging to buy the entire table. My phone buzzed again. "Naomi, seller accepts your terms. 30-day close possible, but they'll take 21 for additional 50,000. Possession upon recording. Advise? 21 days. That would put closing right before Thanksgiving." I typed back, "Offer 10-day close. Additional 100,000. Must have possession upon recording. November 28th, by 5 p.m. Thanksgiving was November 28th this year. "Actually," I said to Margaret, my voice steady, "I should check with the catering staff first. Make sure everything's on schedule." You know how important timing is for a perfect dinner. "Timing," Margaret repeated, amused. "Yes, dear. Some of us understand that instinctively. Others, well, they learn eventually. Or they don't." I smiled, thinking of the recording timestamp that would soon change everything. "You're absolutely right. Margaret, timing is everything." The cocktail hour before dinner was Margaret's favorite stage where she could conduct her social orchestra with the precision of a maestro who knew exactly which notes would sting. The library had been transformed into a reception space, with servers gliding between clusters of guests, offering champagne and carefully crafted canapes that cost more per bite than most people spent on entire meals. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet someone special," Margaret announced, her voice cutting through the conversational hum. A man in his early 40s, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit, stepped forward with the kind of confidence that came from never having been denied anything. "This is Caleb Royce, from Royce Heritage Realty. He specializes in preserving the architectural integrity of historic estates, keeping them in the right hands, so to speak." Caleb's handshake was firm, practiced, his smile revealing teeth too white to be anything but cosmetically enhanced. "Margaret tells me you work in technology." He said it the way someone might say sanitation, necessary but distasteful. "Product development," I replied, matching his tone. "I lead teams that solve problems most people don't know exist." "How modern," he mused, already looking past me to greet someone more worthy of his attention. "Though I find real value lies in permanence, legacy properties, established families, traditions that endure. Not every." His pause was deliberate. Visitor to Fairwater understands that distinction. Visitor. There it was again, that careful positioning of me as outsider, tourist, temporary. Margaret clinked her crystal flute with a silver spoon, gathering attention. Caleb was just telling me about the importance of maintaining Fairwater's character, how certain elements can dilute an area's prestige if we're not careful about who we welcome. The room murmured agreement. Patricia, Margaret's sister, added, "It's about standards, knowing who belongs and who's just passing through." I felt Ethan shift beside me, uncomfortable but silent. His hand brushed mine in apology, a warning I couldn't tell anymore. "Speaking of belonging," Margaret continued, her gaze finding me with laser precision, I think it's time we were clear about something. The room quieted, sensing blood in the water. Thanksgiving is about family. Real family. Those who share not just our table, but our values, our heritage, our understanding of what it means to be Margaret. Ethan started, but she raised her hand. No, darling, this needs to be said. She turned to face me fully, and in that moment, I saw decades of careful breeding, generations of assumed superiority, centuries of believing that geography and genealogy determined worth. Ava, you're a lovely girl, truly. But at Thanksgiving, in this house, you don't belong here. The words hung in the air like a challenge flag thrown down in an ancient duel. Someone gasped softly. A champagne flute clinked against a ring. The servers froze mid-stride, unsure whether to continue their choreographed service. I smiled, not the practiced smile I'd worn all evening, but something genuine, almost peaceful. You're right, Margaret. I don't belong here. She blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. I don't belong in a place where worth is measured by grandparents' bank accounts rather than personal achievement, where tradition means excluding anyone who didn't summer in the Hamptons as a child, where family is defined by blood rather than choice. My phone vibrated. I glanced down at the message from Naomi. Seller accepted all terms. 10-day close confirmed. Recording scheduled for 6:58 p.m. on November 28th. Maple Key Holdings LLC will own Briarcliff Manor. Possession upon recording. 6:58 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day, 2 minutes before the county recorder's office closed for the holiday weekend. But you know what's interesting about belonging. Margaret, I continued, my voice steady as granite. It's not about being welcomed. It's about having the right to stay. Caleb Royce laughed, a dismissive sound. Rights in Fairwater. Rights are earned through through legal documentation. I interrupted. Deeds, titles, contracts. The kind of boring paperwork that actually determines who owns what, who controls what, who decides what. Margaret's eyes narrowed. If you're quite finished with your little speech, perhaps we should move to dinner. Of course, I agreed, setting down my untouched champagne. After all, we wouldn't want to disrupt the schedule. I know how important it is that everything happens at exactly the right time. As we moved toward the dining room, I caught sight of another Northgate Estate Services employee, this one carrying a tablet displaying floor plans and access codes. He nodded at me a brief, professional acknowledgement that I chose to interpret as confirmation. The infrastructure was being documented. The smart home system was being prepared for transfer. The stage was being set. I thought about ethics, about whether what I was planning was fair. Margaret had wounded me with words, with exclusion, with 1,000 small cuts designed to make me feel worthless. I was about to wound her with something far more tangible, the loss of her authority, her control over the very ground she stood on. Was financial revenge proportionate to emotional violence? Then I remembered the post-nuptial agreement she'd tried to force, the way she'd attempted to legally codify my unworthiness. She'd tried to use the law to mark me as temporary. I was simply using the same tools to mark my permanence. Tell me, Caleb, I said as we walked. In your experience with heritage properties, have you ever seen ownership change hands unexpectedly? Say, right in the middle of an important family gathering. He looked at me oddly. That would be highly unusual. These transactions are typically planned months in advance, handled with discretion. Typically, I agreed. But sometimes, timing is everything. Margaret was already at the head of the table, arranging people like chess pieces, the worthy guests near her, the questionable ones progressively farther away. My place card was, predictably, at the far end, nearly in the kitchen. I picked it up, studied the elegant calligraphy of my name, my married name. At least she'd gotten that right and set it back down. In 2 hours, I'd own the chair she sat in, the table she presided over, the very floor beneath her feet. Shall we say grace? Margaret suggested, raising her hands. I bowed my head with everyone else, but my prayer was different. I prayed for the wire transfer to clear, for the recording to process, for the access codes to update exactly as planned. Most of all, I prayed for the strength to see this through, because Margaret was right about one thing: I didn't belong here. Not as a guest, anyway. The 10 days between accepting Margaret's public humiliation and the closing passed in a blur of careful orchestration. I became a conductor of my own symphony, each movement precisely timed, each note calibrated for maximum impact. The structure was elegant in its simplicity. Maple Key Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware for privacy, with myself as the sole member. The operating agreement had been drafted by Naomi Blake, my attorney, who specialized in high-stakes real estate acquisitions and understood the value of discretion. The LLC's bank account at Pine Bank held exactly $3.8 million, enough to purchase Briarcliff Manor outright with a cushion for closing costs and the additional $100,000 I'd offered for the expedited timeline. The money itself had come from multiple sources, each legitimate, each carefully documented. The largest chunk, $2.3 million, from the sale of my patent portfolio to ByteStream Dynamics. Another $800,000 from the early vesting of my retention grants at Lumen Grid Labs, triggered by a clause I'd negotiated 3 years ago. $400,000 from liquidating my private investment account, the one I'd never told Ethan about because it predated our marriage and, thanks to Margaret's insisted upon post-nuptial agreement, remained solely mine. The rest from various consulting contracts and speaking engagements I'd accumulated over the years. The seller is anxious, Naomi had informed me during one of our encrypted calls. They're an overseas investment group, and Briarcliff has been hemorrhaging maintenance costs. Your all-cash offer with no inspection contingency is exactly what they wanted. The inspection waiver had been calculated. I'd done my research. Every permit, every renovation, every structural report filed with Hawthorne County was public record. The mansion was immaculate, recently updated with smart home technology that would make the transfer even smoother. What about the Thanksgiving booking? I'd asked. So, the current rental agreement with Margaret Hart, ironclad protection for you, Naomi assured me. The lease explicitly states that rental privileges end at 10 p.m. on November 28th. After that, they're trespassing if they remain without the owner's permission. And as of 6:58 p.m., that owner will be Maple Key Holdings, which means you. The wire transfer had been initiated at 9 a.m. on Monday. Confirmed received by escrow at 9:47 a.m. Pine Bank's private wealth manager had called personally to verify the transaction, moving nearly $4 million raised flags that required personal confirmation. Purchasing an investment property. Mrs. Hart, he'd asked carefully. Something like that, I'd replied. A property that's been in the wrong hands for too long. The title search came back clean, no liens, no encumbrances, no surprises. The sellers had owned Briarcliff for just 18 months, having purchased it as an investment property they'd hoped to flip. The renovation costs had exceeded their projections. The rental income hadn't materialized as expected, and my offer was their escape route. The ethical weight of my plan kept me awake some nights. I'd lie beside Ethan, listening to his breathing, wondering if this revenge would cost me my marriage. He loved his mother, despite her flaws. Could he love a wife who'd orchestrated such a complete reversal of power? But then I'd remember every slight, every dismissal, every moment she'd made me feel like an interloper in my own life. The way she'd introduced me as Ethan's wife, but never by my name. The Christmas where she'd given every woman in the family heirloom jewelry except me, claiming she'd forgotten I'd be there. The time she'd told her book club, in my presence, that Ethan's marriage was just a phase, like his college interest in socialism. The recording had been scheduled for the last possible moment, 6:58 p.m., on Thanksgiving Day. The county recorder's office closed at 7 p.m. on Wednesdays, and this would be the last transaction before the 4-day holiday weekend. I'd paid an additional $5,000 for the accommodation of having staff stay those extra minutes. The deed will be recorded and ownership transfers immediately, Naomi had explained. Connecticut follows race notice recording statutes, which means once that deed is recorded, you're the legal owner, period. I'd arranged for Northgate Estate Services to be on standby. At exactly 7:30 p.m., they would receive an automated notification to transfer all smart home access codes to the new owner, the security system, the climate control, the electronic locks. Everything would recognize Maple Key Holdings LLC as the authority. "Are you sure about the timing?" Naomi had asked during our final preparation call. "We could do this any other day. Less dramatic." "It has to be Thanksgiving," I'd insisted. "She needs to understand what it feels like to have your belonging questioned in front of everyone who matters to you." The possession clause had been crucial. Upon recording meant the second that deed was filed. I owned Briarcliff Manor. Not the next day. Not after a waiting period immediately. The current rental agreement Margaret had signed included a provision that she'd probably overlooked the owner reserved the right to enter the property with proper notice after 5 p.m. on the rental date. I'd sent that notice by certified mail. Signature required. Margaret had signed for it 3 days ago, probably tossing it aside with the other trivial paperwork she considered beneath her attention. The insurance had been arranged, liability coverage beginning the moment of recording. The catering contract for Thanksgiving dinner had a clause allowing the property owner or their designated representative to approve final payment. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for. My phone buzzed with updates from Naomi throughout the week. Sellers signed, escrow confirmed, title insurance issued, recording documents prepared. Each message was a step closer to the moment when Margaret's words would finally cost her something real. The NDA had been the masterpiece. Everyone involved Naomi, the escrow officer, the title company. Even the county recorder's office had signed non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from revealing the buyer's identity until after the recording. Maple Key Holdings LLC would remain a mystery until I chose to reveal it. On Tuesday, I'd driven past Briarcliff alone, parking at the gates to study the property that would soon be mine. It was beautiful. I had to admit, Margaret had excellent taste in venues. The limestone gleamed in the afternoon sun, the grounds were meticulously maintained, and the whole estate radiated the kind of established elegance that couldn't be faked. "You'll be in better hands soon," I'd whispered to the house, like it could hear me. Wednesday night, the eve of Thanksgiving, I'd stood in my closet, selecting my outfit, not the designer dress Margaret would expect me to squeeze into, desperate for her approval. Instead, I chose a simple but impeccably tailored black suit, the kind of thing you'd wear to a business meeting where you were about to close the deal of a lifetime, because that's exactly what tomorrow would be, not a family dinner where I begged for acceptance, but a business transaction where I already owned everything that mattered. "Ready for tomorrow?" Ethan had asked, wrapping his arms around me from behind. "More than ready," I'd replied, leaning into his warmth while I still could. After tomorrow, this embrace might never happen again. But some things were worth losing, and some victories were worth any price. Thanksgiving Day arrived crisp and clear, the kind of New England morning that Margaret would call divine providence for her grand performance. As Ethan and I dressed in our bedroom, I watched him adjust his tie, the one his mother had given him last Christmas. Of course. "Mother called 3 times already," he said, not meeting my eyes in the mirror. "She wants us there early to help with placement settings." "Place settings," I repeated, buttoning my suit jacket. "Because apparently where someone sits determines their worth." He turned to face me, and I saw the exhaustion in his eyes. 3 years of being caught between his wife and his mother had aged him in ways that weren't visible until moments like this. "Ava, I know she was harsh last time, but—" "Harsh," I interrupted. "She told me I don't belong, in front of 40 people. She didn't mean—" "She did, Ethan. She meant every word." I picked up my phone, checking the encrypted message from Naomi. "Recording scheduled confirmed. Documents in escrow. Wire cleared and verified. 6:58 p.m. In less than 12 hours. Everything would change. The drive to Briarcliff was silent except for the NPR station Ethan always played when he was anxious. As we pulled through those iron gates for what might be the last time as guests, I saw Margaret on the front steps, directing staff like a general preparing for battle. She'd chosen burgundy today, her power color, the one she wore when she intended to dominate completely. "Ethan, darling." She embraced him, then turned to me with that practiced smile. "Ava, how punctual." Inside, the mansion hummed with activity. Margaret had truly outdone herself. The dining room table stretched endlessly, set with china that probably predated the Revolutionary War. Crystal glasses stood at attention like soldiers, each place setting a small fortress of silver and propriety. "Now then," Margaret announced, producing a seating chart with the ceremony of Moses presenting the tablets. "Let me show you where everyone belongs." She walked us through the arrangements, her manicured finger pointing out each assignment. The mayor's wife here, the country club president there, old money clustered around her throne at the head, and at the far end, so distant we'd need binoculars to maintain eye contact, my place card. "I thought wives traditionally sat near their husbands," Ethan ventured. Margaret's laugh tinkled. "Oh, darling, traditions evolve. We must consider the comfort of all our guests. Some people just naturally gravitate toward the periphery." Patricia arrived next, air-kissing Margaret and ignoring me entirely. Then came the cousins, the business associates, the social climbing acquaintances who Margaret kept close enough to use but never close enough to matter. Each arrival shifted the room's energy, adding another layer to the performance. "Did you see the email about the Henderson boy?" Patricia asked Margaret, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Harvard Law, then directly to Sullivan and Cromwell. His mother says he's still single." She glanced at me. "Though I suppose not everyone can appreciate that kind of pedigree." "Speaking of pedigree," Margaret added, "Caleb Royce will be joining us again. He's been researching Fairwater's founding families. Fascinating how some bloodlines maintain their prominence while others—" "Well," her shrug said everything. I excused myself to the powder room, needing a moment to center myself. In the mirror, I saw what they saw: a woman who didn't inherit her cheekbones from a Mayflower passenger, whose ancestors hadn't donated wings to hospitals or libraries to universities. But I also saw what they couldn't: someone who'd earned every achievement, who'd built rather than inherited, who'd chosen to rise rather than been born at altitude. My phone vibrated. A text from someone unexpected: James Morrison. My father. "Proud of you, sweetheart. Whatever happens today, you've already won by being exactly who you are." He didn't know about the purchase, about the plan, but somehow, fathers always know when their daughters are heading into battle. Back in the main room, Margaret was holding court about the dilution of standards in modern society. "Take marriage, for instance," she said, her eyes finding me across the room. It used to mean something. A joining of equals, of compatible backgrounds. Now people marry for feelings. She said it like it was a disease. And look where that leads: discomfort, incompatibility, division in families that once stood united. "Mother," Ethan said quietly, "perhaps we could discuss something else." "Oh, I'm sorry, darling. I didn't realize honesty had become uncomfortable, though I suppose when one marries outside one's circle, comfort becomes a casualty." The dam finally broke. What circle is that exactly?" "Margaret," I asked, my voice carrying across the room. "The circle of people who've never earned anything themselves, who consider trust funds a personality trait." Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. Margaret's smile widened. "Case in point, breeding always shows, doesn't it? You can dress them up, teach them which fork to use, even marry them to your sons, but blood will out, as they say." "You're right about blood," I agreed, standing straighter. "It does show. Your blood shows in the way you treat anyone you consider beneath you, in the way you've spent 3 years trying to break up your son's marriage because his wife didn't come with a pedigree certificate." "How dare—" "I'm not finished!" I pulled out my phone, checking the time. 4:37 p.m. Just over 2 hours until the recording. You want to talk about belonging, about who deserves to be here. Let's talk about it. But let's be specific. Let's talk about legal belonging. About documented, notarized, recorded belonging? Margaret laughed, that crystal tinkling sound that I'd grown to despise. Legal. My dear, we're discussing society, not some tenant dispute. Behind her, I saw one of the Northgate employees entering data into a tablet. He glanced up, caught my eye, and nodded slightly. The smart home system was ready for transfer. Actually, I said, everything comes down to legal when you really think about it. Marriage is a legal contract. Property is a legal concept. Even your precious bloodlines only matter because of legal inheritance structures. Is this your idea of appropriate dinner conversation? Margaret asked, her voice dripping condescension. Perhaps this is why you struggle so much with belonging. You don't understand the subtle "I understand perfectly." I interrupted. I understand that in 2 hours and 21 minutes, this conversation is going to become very different. Ethan stood up, his face pale. Ava, what are you talking about? I met his eyes, seeing the confusion there, the worry. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, to warn him, but he'd chosen his side so many times before. He'd stood silent while his mother carved away pieces of my dignity. This time, he'd have to weather the storm without advance notice. Nothing, darling, I said, using Margaret's pet name for him. Just discussing the importance of timing. Your mother's right, some of us don't belong here. The question is who gets to decide who those people are? Margaret stood, her burgundy dress catching the light like spilled wine. I decide. This is my event, my family, my tradition. Your event, I agreed. But for how much longer? The room was electric now, everyone sensing blood in the water but not sure whose it would be. Margaret's friends closed ranks around her, their faces masks of inherited disdain. Ethan stood between us, literally and figuratively, his hands half raised as if he could physically stop what was coming. My phone buzzed. Naomi, final walkthrough complete. All documents ready. Recording will proceed as scheduled. 6:58 p.m. The countdown had begun. The dinner bell rang at precisely 6 p.m., its silver tone cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. Margaret stood at the head of the table, her burgundy dress making her look like a queen presiding over her court. The candlelight caught the diamonds at her throat. 3 generations of Hartwomen had worn that necklace. She'd told me once, and I'd never be one of them. Please, everyone, find your places, she commanded, gesturing to the elaborate seating arrangement she'd orchestrated. The table was a masterpiece of social engineering power clustered at her end, diminishing in waves until it reached my lonely outpost near the kitchen door. The scent of roasted turkey mingled with rosemary and sage, while the sound of silver against china created a symphony of privilege. Each place setting was perfect, from the hand-calligraphed name cards to the individual salt cellars that Margaret insisted separated proper dining from common meals. I took my assigned seat, feeling the distance between myself and the rest of the family like a physical gulf. Ethan sat halfway down the table, close enough to his mother to matter, far enough from me to make a statement. He kept glancing my way, anxiety written in every line of his face. Before we begin, Margaret announced, raising her glass of Chateau d'Yquem, I'd like to say a few words about tradition, about family, about maintaining the standards that make gatherings like this possible. She launched into what could only be described as a sermon on bloodlines and belonging. Her words were carefully chosen, each phrase a small dagger aimed at anyone she deemed unworthy, which, in this room, meant me. Briarcliff Manor has hosted some of society's finest families, she continued, gesturing to the coffered ceiling, the oil paintings of long-dead aristocrats that lined the walls. These walls have witnessed generations of proper breeding, careful cultivation of values that matter. Not everyone appreciates such spaces. Not everyone deserves them. Here, Caleb Royce called out, raising his own glass. Others followed suit, the room filling with murmurs of agreement. I glanced at my phone, tucked discreetly in my lap. 6:23 p.m., 35 minutes. Some people, Margaret continued, her gaze finding me with laser precision, believe that money alone grants access, that a decent job, a lucky marriage, can erase the fundamental differences between those who belong and those who visit. Patricia laughed, the sound sharp as breaking crystal. Remember when the Northbrooks tried to buy their way into the club? Money can't buy class, as Mother always said. Exactly, Margaret agreed, which is why it's so important to maintain boundaries. To remember that while we may be polite to everyone, we don't owe everyone a place at our table. Some people are meant to serve, others to be served. It's the natural order. The server, a young woman who couldn't have been older than 22, flinched slightly as she set down the soup course. I caught her eye, offered what I hoped was a sympathetic smile. She looked away quickly, trained not to acknowledge the diners as people. "I'd like to propose a toast," Margaret said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never been contradicted in any way that mattered. To keeping Fairwater pure, to maintaining standards, to remembering that belonging isn't granted, it's inherited. Everyone raised their glasses. Everyone except me. "Ava," Margaret said, her tone poisonously sweet, "aren't you going to toast? Or is this another example of your unfamiliarity with proper etiquette?" I stood slowly, picking up my water glass. I hadn't touched the wine. "I'll toast," I said, my voice steady. "To inheritance, to the transfer of assets from one generation to the next, to the legal mechanisms that determine ownership, and to the fact that in exactly 29 minutes, those mechanisms are going to make this evening very interesting." Confused silence rippled through the room. "She's having some sort of episode," Patricia stage whispered. "This is what happens when you marry outside your class. Mental instability." Ethan half rose from his chair. "Ava, what are you—" "Sit down, Ethan," Margaret commanded, and he did, trained from birth to obey that voice. "Your wife is clearly overwhelmed. Perhaps she should take some air." "I'm exactly where I need to be," I replied, checking my phone again. 6:37 p.m. Naomi had just sent a photo the recording documents, stamped and ready, waiting at the county office. The turkey arrived, golden and glistening, presented with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for state dinners. Margaret stood to carve it herself. Another tradition, another display of her dominion over this gathering. "You know," she said as she sliced through the breast meat, the knife moving with practiced precision. "I've been thinking about making some changes for next year. Perhaps a smaller gathering. Family only. Blood family. I mean, it would be so much more comfortable." "That sounds perfect," Caleb agreed. "Exclusivity maintains value, in real estate and in society." My phone buzzed. 6:45 p.m. 13 minutes. "Speaking of real estate," I said conversationally, "did you know Briarcliff Manor has been sold?" Margaret's knife paused mid-slice. "Don't be ridiculous. The owners would have notified me if they were selling. I have a standing rental agreement. Actually, the sale was very quiet. All cash offer, 10-day close. The new owner takes possession at exactly 6:58 p.m. tonight." The room went silent except for the crackling of the fireplace. Margaret laughed, but there was an edge to it now. "That's impossible. I would have been informed. Caleb, you would have heard about this." Caleb pulled out his phone, frowning as he typed rapidly. I don't see any listing, but—" His face paled slightly. "There is a recording scheduled for today. Maple Key Holdings, LLC. "Who?" Margaret demanded. I smiled, the kind of smile I'd learned from her all teeth. No warmth. "That would be telling, but I can share that the new owner has very specific ideas about who belongs here." 6:52 p.m. 6 minutes. Ethan stood up, his face cycling through confusion, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Ava, if this is some kind of joke—" "No joke," I assured him. "Just business. The kind of transaction your mother should appreciate. After all, she believes so strongly in property rights, in ownership determining everything." Margaret slammed the carving knife down, making the china rattle. "You're lying. This is some pathetic attempt to—" My phone rang. Naomi's number. "Excuse me," I said, answering it on speaker. "Yes, Ms. Hart." Naomi's professional voice filled the dining room. "I'm calling to confirm that the recording of the deed for Briarcliff Manor will be completed in 4 minutes. As we discussed, the Smart Home Access System will transfer to Maple Key Holdings LLC at 7:30 p.m., and the current rental agreement expires at 10 p.m. tonight." "Thank you," I said calmly. "Please proceed." I ended the call and looked around the table at the frozen faces, the dropped jaws, the widening eyes. Margaret's face had gone from burgundy to white, her hands gripping the carving knife like a weapon. "You didn't," she whispered. 6:57, I said, watching the seconds tick by on my phone. "1 more minute until I own every inch of ground you're standing on. Margaret. 1 more minute until you're having dinner in my house. 1 more minute until you need my permission to stay." The grandfather clock in the corner began to chime the hour, each note hanging in the air like a judgment. The grandfather clock finished its 7th chime, and my phone lit up with a notification from the county recorder's office, a digital receipt, time-stamped 6:59 p.m., confirming the deed had been recorded. I stood slowly, reaching into my jacket's inner pocket to withdraw the envelope I'd been carrying all evening. "This," I said, placing it on the walnut table with deliberate precision, right next to Margaret's abandoned carving knife, "is your proof." With shaking hands, Margaret snatched the envelope, tearing it open. The documents spilled out the recorded deed with its official seal, the county stamp visible even in the candlelight, the transfer paperwork showing Maple Key Holdings LLC as the new owner of record. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying the authority that comes from holding every card that matters. "Welcome to my home." The room erupted. Patricia knocked over her wine glass, the Chateau d'Yquem spreading across the antique lace tablecloth like blood. Caleb Royce was frantically scrolling through his phone, trying to verify what couldn't be denied. Several guests half stood, unsure whether to flee or fight. "This is fraud!" Margaret shrieked, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't! This isn't Ethan! Do something!" But Ethan was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "Ava, how?" "The same way your family got everything," I replied. "I paid for it. Every dollar earned, not inherited. Every penny from my own work, my own innovation, my own value that your mother could never see past her prejudice." A knock at the dining room door interrupted the chaos. Jonathan Wells from Northgate Estate Services entered, his tablet in hand, followed by 2 colleagues. He was exactly on time, 7:30 p.m. "Ms. Hart," he addressed me formally, ignoring the pandemonium around us. "I'm here to confirm the smart home transfer. The access codes have been updated. Your biometric data has been uploaded to all entry points. The previous access permissions have been suspended pending your approval." He handed me a tablet showing the home's digital infrastructure, every lock, every camera, every system now under my control. I pressed my thumb to the scanner, confirming my identity. The lights throughout the mansion flickered once, twice, then steadied the system acknowledging its new master. "Additionally," Jonathan continued, his voice professional and detached, "I need to verify the current occupant's status. According to the rental agreement, the previous arrangement expires at 10 p.m. tonight. Would you like security on standby?" "That won't be necessary," I said, looking directly at Margaret. "I'm sure everyone here understands property law. Trespassing charges are so unpleasant, especially for people with reputations to maintain." "You conniving little," Margaret started, but Caleb grabbed her arm. "Margaret, she's right. If she owns it, if the deed is recorded." He looked sick. She can have us all arrested if we're here past 10. I pulled out a second document, the rental agreement Margaret had signed, with the relevant sections highlighted in yellow. Actually, if you look at Section 4, subsection C, you'll see that the owner that's me now can revoke permission with cause. And I'd say public humiliation and 3 years of systematic emotional abuse constitute cause. This is our family dinner, Margaret snarled. Our tradition. Your dinner, I corrected. But my dining room, my table, my house. Funny how possession changes everything, doesn't it? Ethan finally found his voice. Ava, you bought this to… What, humiliate my mother? No, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. I bought it to make a point. Your mother said I don't belong here. She was right. I don't belong as a guest at her table, begging for scraps of approval, accepting whatever seat she deigns to give me. But as the owner, I belong completely, legally, undeniably. I picked up the carving knife Margaret had abandoned, testing its weight. The question now is whether any of you belong here, in my house, at my table. You can't kick us out, Patricia protested. We're in the middle of dinner. Actually, I can, I replied, but I'm not as cruel as you've been to me. You can finish your meal. You have until 10 p.m., as the original agreement states, though I should mention the catering contract requires the owner's approval for final payment. That would be me. I signaled to the server, the young woman who'd flinched earlier. Please bring the payment tablet. She approached nervously, and I signed with a flourish, adding a 40% tip. Her eyes widened. Thank you for your service, I told her. And please let the kitchen staff know they're welcome to take home any leftovers. I believe in sharing abundance with people who actually work for it. Margaret's hands were trembling now, rage and humiliation warring on her face. You think you've won something? You think buying a house makes you one of us? No, I said simply. I think it makes you my guest. And unlike you, I believe in treating all my guests with basic courtesy. So please, finish your dinner. Enjoy the turkey you so carefully carved in my dining room. Drink your wine from my crystal, and at 10 p.m., you'll leave my property. Ethan, Margaret turned to her son desperately. Your wife has lost her mind. This is financial abuse. Ethan looked between us, his face a study in conflict. Ava, we need to talk about this. You spent millions without telling me, with my money. I reminded him. My patents, my work, my earnings. The money you were happy to let your mother pretend didn't exist because it didn't come with the right pedigree. Besides, didn't you sit silent when she tried to force that post-nuptial agreement, when she insisted our finances be separate to protect Hart family assets? Well, congratulations. They're separate. My phone buzzed. A message from my father. Whatever you're doing, I love you. Then another. From Naomi. Recording confirmed in public record. Title insurance active. Congratulations on your purchase. I looked around the table at the stunned faces, the spilled wine, the half-carved turkey growing cold. This room that had been Margaret's stage for performing superiority was now mine. I'll ask you once, I said, my voice quiet but carrying clearly. Margaret, would you like to leave my house now, or would you prefer to ask a permission to stay through dinner? The silence that followed was complete. Even the fire seemed to pause its crackling, waiting for her answer. Margaret Hart, queen of Fairwater society, arbiter of who belonged and who didn't, looked at me with eyes that finally saw me as something more than an interloper. We'll stay, she whispered, the words clearly costing her everything. May we stay through dinner? Yes, I said, sitting back down in my exile seat at the far end of the table. You may stay in my house until 10. All of you. Consider it my Thanksgiving gift a lesson in how it feels to need permission to belong. The next 2 hours passed in a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. Forks scraped against china with the careful precision of people afraid that any sudden movement might shatter more than just dishes. The magnificent dinner Margaret had orchestrated, the turkey, the 7 side dishes, the 3 different pies sat largely untouched, appetite being the first casualty of reversed power. I remained in my assigned seat at the far end of the table, eating slowly, tasting victory with every bite. The distance Margaret had created to diminish me now worked in reverse. I was untouchable, unreachable, a judge presiding over the dissolution of her carefully constructed kingdom. At 8:45 p. Patricia was the first to break. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "I need to leave," she announced to no one in particular, gathering her things with shaking hands. "Drive safely," I called out pleasantly. "The smart locks will register your exit." One by one, others followed. The mayor's wife murmured something about another engagement. Caleb Royce left without a word, his face the color of curdled cream. By 9:30 p.m., only Margaret, Ethan, and 2 cousins remained, held in place by either stubbornness or shock. Margaret hadn't moved from her position at the head of the table, my table, her hands folded in her lap like a deposed queen awaiting exile. The burgundy dress that had marked her as royalty now looked like a costume, outdated and irrelevant. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why this way?" I stood, walking the length of the dining room with deliberate steps, my heels clicking against the floor I now owned. "Because you needed to understand what it feels like, to be told you don't belong, to have your worth questioned not because of what you've done, but because of who you are, or in your twisted logic, who you aren't." "I was protecting my family," she said, some of her old fire returning. "Protecting Ethan from what a woman who loves him, who built a career from nothing, who earned every achievement instead of inheriting it." I stopped beside her chair. "You weren't protecting anything, Margaret. You were performing, playing the role of gatekeeper to a kingdom that was never yours to guard." Ethan stood then, his face a map of conflict. "Ava, we need to discuss this. You bought a $3 million house without telling me." $3.8 million, I corrected. "And yes, I did. Just like your mother tried to financially cage me without asking my opinion. Just like you stood by for 3 years while she chipped away at my dignity without defending me once." "That's not fair." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Was it fair when she seated me by the kitchen, when she introduced me as Ethan's current wife at the club, when she gave family heirlooms to everyone except me last Christmas?" The grandfather clock began chiming. 9:45 p.m. 15 minutes, I announced. 15 minutes left in my house. Margaret stood slowly, her dignity wrapped around her like armor with visible cracks. She walked to where I stood, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked directly at me, not through me, not past me, but at me. "You've made your point," she said quietly. "Have I, because I own this house now. Margaret, I could host Thanksgiving here next year. I could invite everyone except you. I could make you understand exactly how it feels to be excluded from spaces you once controlled." I paused, letting that sink in. "But I won't." Confusion flickered across her face. "I'm not you," I continued. "I don't need to diminish others to feel valuable. This house, it's just property. It's not my worth, my identity, my weapon. It's proof that belonging isn't inherited or granted or decided by committee. It's earned. And tonight, I earned the right to never ask for your permission again." I pulled out my phone, opening the smart home app. With a few taps, I generated a temporary access code. "This will get you back in tomorrow at noon to collect anything you left behind. The rental company will forward your security deposit within 5 business days." Margaret took the slip of paper with the code, her fingers brushing mine. For a moment, I saw something in her eyes, not respect, exactly, but recognition. The recognition of one fighter acknowledging another's victory. "Ethan," she said, turning to her son, "you married a formidable woman." "I married the woman I love," Ethan said quietly, and for the first time in 3 years, he stepped away from his mother and toward me. Ava, I'm sorry. I should have. We'll talk later, I said, not ready for that conversation, not in front of her. Right now, you all need to leave. They gathered their things in silence. Designer coats whispered against designer bags. Keys jingled, phones were checked. The cousins scurried out first, desperate to spread this gossip across Fairwater before midnight. Margaret moved with forced grace, her head high despite her defeat. At the door, she turned back one last time. The house suits you, she said, and I couldn't tell if it was sincere or one last barb. I know, I replied simply. Ethan was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway, backlit by the porch lights, looking lost. Where do I go? That's your choice, I said. You can go with your mother, or you can come home with your wife. But if you come home, understand that things change. Boundaries get established. Respect becomes non-negotiable. He nodded slowly. I'll see you at home. And then they were gone. All of them. The house exhaled into silence, as if it too had been holding its breath. I walked back through my dining room, past the abandoned feast, the overturned wine glasses, the carving knife still lying where I'd placed it. In the great room, I kicked off my heels and sank into the leather chair that Margaret had occupied during cocktail hour. My phone rang. Naomi. Congratulations, homeowner, she said warmly. How did it go? Exactly as planned, I replied, looking around at the magnificent space that was now legally, undeniably mine. Any regrets? I thought about it, really considered the question. No. For 3 years, I tried to earn something that was never available for purchase Margaret's approval. Tonight, I bought something better, my freedom from needing it. After ending the call, I sat in the silence of my new house, watching the fire die down to embers. Tomorrow, there would be consequences to navigate. Conversations with Ethan about trust and money and the future. Decisions about what to do with a mansion I'd bought for revenge but now owned in reality. But tonight, I belonged exactly where I was. Not because someone granted me permission, not because I'd married into it, but because I'd claimed it with the only currency that ultimately matters, the willingness to stop asking for a seat at the table and instead buy the whole damn dining room. The grandfather clock chimed 11 p.m., and I smiled. In the distance, I could hear cars starting, driving away, carrying the news of Margaret Hart's Thanksgiving humiliation across Fairwater's carefully maintained social network. Let them talk. Let them whisper about the woman who bought her revenge with cash and served it with turkey and stuffing. I had a house to explore, a marriage to either save or end, and a future that no longer required anyone else's approval. For the first time in 3 years, I was exactly where I belonged. Home. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of sweet revenge, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Ava's situation? Let me know in the comments.